Welcome back to The Path of Flame by Yodepalma. Chapter 1. Coming Out Strong. 10 years later. "Dad, it's here!" Harry yelled, running into the kitchen with a pile of mail clutched in his hand. He jumped into his usual chair and dropped all but one of the envelopes on the table. The last one he brandished in Roy's direction. The envelope was thick and strangely textured, nothing at all like the smooth paper on the table, and it was addressed to Mr. H. Potter, second floor bedroom, of all things. Roy, busy at the stove, barely managed to send him a pleased smile. "Well, go on then. Open it and read it," he said warmly as he flipped over another one of the pancakes in his pan. Harry grinned widely before he finally slit the envelope open and started reading the letter within. He was frowning a little by the end of it, eyeing the list of materials uncertainly. He wondered where they might find the books they asked for. He couldn't remember stumbling across them in any shop they'd been in. What kind of a name for a school is Hogwarts? Harry jumped at the sound of Ed's voice and turned a scowl on the approaching man. Ed ignored it and ruffled his hair before picking up the envelope discarded on the table. He made a face at the crest on the back, then peered inside and pulled out a smaller envelope that Harry had failed to notice. This one's for your dad." "Could you open it?" Roy asked. "I'm a little busy with breakfast, unless you want to take over." "Not in the mood for burnt food today, thanks," Ed replied dismissively as he tore open the new envelope. His eyes rose as he read the short note and dumped something small and shiny into his palm. "Looks like the kid's parents left him some money in England. Something about waiting to give it to him until he needed it for school. Sounds like bullshit to me." "Do you have to curse in front of Harry?" Roy asked plaintively, finally turning from the stove with a plate high with pancakes in one hand. He couldn't have been that angry, though, because the other hand he used to pull Ed in for a short kiss. Harry grimaced at them. It was still kind of weird, this thing between his dad and the former Fullmetal Alchemist. He faintly remembered a time when his dad would come home grumbling unhappy about Ed's latest mishap on one mission or another. But whatever relationship those two had had while Ed was still in the military seemed irrelevant 3 years later. Ed made his dad smile more often than he had before, and that was worth putting up with how gross they were with each other. "Like he doesn't know all the bad words already," Ed muttered back with a roll of his eyes. But there was no heat in his voice. They'd had this argument 100 times before. Harry heaved a dramatic sigh to get their attention again. "So where do we get all this stuff?" he asked, pointedly waving his acceptance letter at his dad. "I didn't even know people still used parchment and quill." "Nor did I," Roy responded with a shake of his head. "Must be a wizarding thing outside the country. They're very isolationist, and don't seem to appreciate muggles much. We'll have to go to England to get everything. I'll check in with the Gringotts branch on the way to work and see if the goblins know where to go." "When are we going to find time for you to go to England?" Ed asked. "You're already ditching for Harry's birthday. Don't think the generals will be too pleased with you taking more time off." "I'll just have to go over the weekend," Roy sighed, clearly not liking the idea. Considering that Harry was banned from bothering them before 11 on weekend mornings, he wasn't surprised. "Can we just go on my birthday?" Harry asked, somewhat hopefully. "I know we're not having a party this year, so I don't think anyone will miss us." "I imagine they'd still want to wish you a happy birthday, Harry," Roy said, looking at him thoughtfully. "Though, maybe if we go early enough, we could still be back for dinner. And then you wouldn't have to go in on your day off before I leave," Harry added. Roy grinned at him, which Harry took as an agreement, and turned to Ed. "Will you come too, Ed?" he asked the blonde man, automatically giving him a pitiful look. He'd learnt quickly that was the best way to get what he wanted out of him. "Hell, I've got nothing better to do," Ed agreed. "And don't give me that look, you're embarrassing yourself." "You just don't want to admit he's got you wrapped around his little finger," Roy cut in teasingly. "You're one to talk. I'm not ashamed. He is my son, after all." Roy looked at his pocket watch and grimaced. "I better get going, so Hawkeye won't have an excuse to shoot me. Harry, make sure you finish your chores before you try and go anywhere." "Yes, Dad," Harry sighed. He'd always hoped the man would forget to remind him. If he didn't say anything, Ed would usually let him get away with slacking. "And you have a good day, darling," Roy said to Ed, and Harry quickly focused on his plate so he didn't have to see the two of them kissing. Seriously, the pet names were gross enough without the reminder that his dad actually had a sex life. I should be home around 7 tonight. Grumman wants me to put in an extra couple of hours so I don't leave any paperwork when I'm off on Wednesday. You could try to stop procrastinating instead, Ed offered in an innocent voice. Bring home takeout? I've got some research to finish and I don't know if I'll be paying enough attention to the time. I wish Al hadn't moved out, Roy sighed. Please eat lunch at least. Harry, check on him around 1 and make sure he ate. Why do I feel like I'm being babysat by a 10-year-old? Ed growled, but Roy didn't seem inclined to respond. Harry looked up just in time to get his head rubbed again, because clearly his dad was evil. And then he was watching his dad's back disappear through the doorway. He and Ed looked at each other at the same time, and Ed gave him a wry smile. I think we're both too dependent for our own good. Speak for yourself, Harry replied loftily, but he wasn't quick enough to dodge the piece of pancake thrown at him. This is the entranceway into the wizarding world, Ed asked sardonically a week later as they stared at the decrepit-looking building in front of them. I think I can actually see it rotting. Maybe it's nicer on the inside, Roy suggested in a doubtful voice. He gestured Harry in front of him and ushered them into the building. Harry made a face, but didn't try to avoid the gentle pushing on his shoulders. He knew his dad was paranoid about something happening to him. Unfortunately, Ed had picked up the habit too, evidenced by the way he stepped into the pub ahead of the both of them, eyes scanning the interior. It didn't look any better than the outside. Ah, you must be Mustang, the bartender called, shuffling out from behind the bar and reaching his hand out to Roy. Roy shook it over Harry's head, but his left hand stayed firmly on his son's shoulder. Straight from a mistress, eh? And this must be your... The old man trailed off as he turned his attention to Harry, eyes settled firmly on his forehead. Goodness, is that really Harry Potter? The sound of the pub died almost instantly, and Harry felt himself shuffle back nervously into his dad's comforting solidity as every eye turned to him. The silence stretched for a long moment, Roy's hand tightening on his shoulder, and then life seemed to return to the place with a loud scraping of a handful of chairs. Harry was sure he was about to be mobbed, but Ed stepped smoothly in front of him. Whatever expression was on his face must have been terrifying, because everyone instantly halted to eye him suspiciously. Back the fuck off, he snarled in a voice Harry had never heard before. Kid's just trying to get to the alley to get school supplies. Doesn't need you jumping down his fucking throat. Thank you, Ed, Roy said very calmly, though his voice was cold. Harry might have grinned if he still wasn't trying to hide from the pub's attention. Sir, could you perhaps point us towards the entrance? We have a lot to do today. I'll take you, a trembling voice said, calling Harry's attention to the pale man at the back of the group. Was just about to head in myself. Got a book to pick up. Despite the stuttering and faint tremble of his hands, he pushed forward to stand before Ed, smiling at all three of them. Professor Quirrell, I'll be one of your teachers, Potter. What do you teach, sir? Harry asked politely, peering around Ed's stocky frame. He really didn't want to alienate one of his teachers before school had even started. Defense against the dark arts. Not that you'll need it, eh? He gave Harry a wide-eyed, almost fearful look, and then turned towards the back of the pub and waved them ahead of him. After you? Thank you, Professor, Roy said smoothly, reaching towards Ed and giving him a poke. Harry stifled a laugh as Ed turned back to Roy, giving him an exaggerated grimace before he followed Quirrell's lead. The Professor took them to a tiny sort of courtyard, counted a few of the bricks, and sharply tapped one of them with his wand 3 times. The wall gradually transformed into a gigantic archway, through which Harry could see a long, winding street. Fancy, Ed muttered, though he didn't sound half as impressed as Harry felt. Granted, he could probably have done the same trick in half a second with his alchemy, but Harry had never had the opportunity to see it. All of his impressive work happened outside the house, which was disappointing, except perhaps for the parts where it meant their house had never accidentally been blown up. A possibility that Roy sometimes muttered direly about. "First time in London?" Quirrell asked quietly. "Can't miss Gringotts. It's the biggest building on the street. I've got to get going. I'm sorry." "It's quite all right, Professor," Roy said, offering a hand that Quirrell shook weakly. "Thank you for your assistance this far." Quirrell gave him a small, trembling smile, grabbed Harry's hand in a brief shake, and strolled off into the depths of the street. "Let's go," Ed said into the ensuing silence, though he was staring after the Professor with a suspicious look. "Don't like that guy." "He seemed perfectly nice," Roy said mildly as they began walking. Ed fell by the older man's side, rather than continuing stomping along in front of them. Harry, twisting around to see the entire street, saw their joined hands and smiled. Roy's thumb was rubbing soothing circles on the back of Ed's hand, a gesture Harry recognised from Roy's many attempts to soothe him when he was upset. "Did something about his manner set you off?" "Not really," Ed replied slowly. "Just got a bad feeling from him, I guess. Might just be paranoid." Roy responded non-committally, but didn't share whatever he was thinking. Harry tilted his head back to get a good look at his face, but it was annoyingly blank. That was his plotting face, which even Harry hadn't even learnt to read. Harry made a mental note to keep his professor at arm's length, though. Their cautious response gave him all the reason he needed not to trust the man. They walked in silence after that, taking in the busy street filled with all kinds of people wearing unflattering robes. And it wasn't long before they were drawing up to a large white building with a scarlet-clad goblin standing out front. They were bowed through a pair of bronze doors, then further through a pair of silver doors, and Harry saw inside a Gringotts bank for the first time in his life. Goblins were everywhere in the cavernous marble room, weighing gemstones and counting money and helping wizards with their accounts. They stepped up to a goblin at a long side counter who didn't seem to be busy. "Good morning," Roy began politely, pulling out a tiny key from his pocket as he spoke. "We'd like to take some money out of Harry Potter's account, please." The goblin took the offered key and inspected it briefly. "That looks to be in order," he said approvingly, though how he knew it was really Harry's key, he didn't know. "I'll have someone take you to his vault." "Grip hook!" Another goblin appeared by their sides quickly, and gestured for them to follow him through one of the back doors. Harry eyed the change in scenery with some excitement as Griphook whistled, and a small mining cart sped up to them. The four of them clambered in somewhat awkwardly, and then they were off, racing through the twisting passageways as quickly as if they were on a roller coaster. The goblin unlocked the vault door, waving his hand distastefully at the billowing green smoke, and when it cleared, Harry felt his jaw drop, and Ed let out a low, impressed whistle. "Damn, kid, you're loaded," he said, stepping into the vault ahead of them, flicking a heap of tiny bronze coins. "Roy's vault isn't nearly half as impressive." "I don't come from a filthy rich family," Roy muttered, picking up a large gold coin and inspecting it. He then pulled an empty bag from his pocket and carefully began counting out some money. He explained the money system as he did so, and then handed the bag full of money to Harry, after checking sure he remembered it. "All yours," he finished warmly. "Thanks," Harry replied faintly, shaking the bag a little to hear the coins clinking in it. He eyed the piles of money left in the vault with an uncertainty. The bagful that Roy had handed to him barely made a dent. "Are you sure you don't need—" "I'm not going to take your money, Harry," Roy responded gently, ushering him out of the vault. "I make more than enough to sustain us at home, especially now that I don't have to worry about the cost of your schooling. As long as you're responsible with your money, and I will be keeping records of your account, I don't see any reason to take what doesn't belong to me." "But you're my dad," Harry emphasised as they climbed back into the cart, and Grip Hook whistled it on its way again. The goblin was clearly listening to them, but Harry couldn't tell if the look on his face was a smile or a grimace. "I thought everything I own belonged to you. Isn't that the law?" "Law and reality don't always mesh, kid," Ed butted in. Harry made a face at him, then returned his attention to his dad, who was looking rather put upon. "Please don't teach my son to be a criminal, darling," Roy said, sighing heavily. "You're such a terrible influence on him." "You act like such a fucking saint, Mustang, but you're not fooling anyone," Ed snorted. "Anyway, he hasn't started cursing at you yet, has he? Despite my careful coaching." "I would never curse at Dad," Harry said hastily, giving his glowering parent a wide-eyed look. Of course, Roy was glowering at Ed, not him, but it was still better to be safe than sorry. "Anyway, you haven't been coaching me. I can't help but pick things up when you curse all the freaking time." "Don't curse at Ed either," Roy said sternly, but Harry could see the smile he was pushing back. "In fact, don't curse at anyone. I won't have people thinking I raised an uncouth little hellion, even if I am dating one." "Who the fuck are you calling little bastard?" Ed snapped on cue. Harry rolled his eyes, but couldn't help notice Ed hadn't objected to being either uncouth or a hellion. He wouldn't be surprised if the man was actually proud of both those descriptions. "Oh, did I say little?" Roy asked, feigning surprise so well that Harry almost believed it. "I'm sure I didn't mean it." "Miniature, maybe." "Dad," Harry moaned in exasperation. Why Roy insisted on riling Ed up, he would never know. "Can you please stop arguing in public? You're embarrassing." "God, you're already starting to sound like a teenager already," was Roy's fond response, to which Ed snorted, and then glared at Roy as if mad at him for daring to be amused. "I can't believe how quickly you turned 11. Thankfully, Harry was saved from coming up with anything resembling a response when the cart came to a halt. Ed was the first one out, eyes darting to the shadows in an automatic sweep. Roy was looking at him with fondness now, and Ed didn't even object when the older man pulled him close, though he did blush. "Then you," Roy said. Voice dropped low. Harry squirmed uncomfortably and looked towards the door that Griphook was waiting impatiently at. 19 already, and more beautiful by the day. You're such a fucking sap, Ed muttered, looking almost as uncomfortable as Harry felt. He took a sharp step backwards, not quite breaking Roy's loose grip on his hip, and tugged at the collar of Roy's shirt to get him moving. "Come on, no sense making the man wait so you can moon over us." "Can I be blamed for taking the time to enjoy my lovely family?" Roy asked, but he rarely refused Ed what he wanted, and followed him to the door. Harry stayed as far away from them as he thought he could get away with without triggering his dad's paranoid senses. "Any man would envy me and my gorgeous young lover and well-behaved son." "So embarrassing," Harry groaned, which caused both his dad and Ed to laugh. At least that made them stop making eyes at each other, but it brought Roy's attention back to him again. The man reached out to tug him closer and wrapped an arm around his shoulders. Harry sighed, perhaps a little too dramatically by Ed's snicker, but knew better than trying to get Roy to let go. It would only make him cling tighter. "Where should we go first?" Roy asked as they stepped back into the sunny street. "I wish we had a map of these stores to make it easier." "Well, why don't we go get his ridiculous uniform?" Ed asked, nodding at the storefront across the street. It announced with cheerful, colourful font that it sold robes for all occasions. "And I can take a quick round the street and while you're waiting with him. Can't be that difficult to memorize where all the stores are." "Maybe not for you," Roy said with a roll of his eyes. "Go on then. Don't take too long." Ed muttered something that may have been in agreement to the demand, then veered off down the street. Harry tugged Roy into the store before the blonde had even fully disappeared from their sight, and was rewarded with the wry smile as if his dad had been caught staring, which he probably had been doing, staring at Ed being one of his favourite pastimes. But Harry chose not to think about it. Instead, he all but dragged his dad into Madame Malkin's and did his best to copy Roy's charming smile when the squat witch approached them. "Hogwarts, dear?" Madame Malkin asked before either of them could start talking. Harry nodded dumbly. "Got the lot up here. Another young man's just been fitted now, in fact." She led him to the back of the store, where a pale boy about Harry's age was standing on the footstool as another witch pinned his robes. The boy gave Harry an assessing glance, but it must have passed muster because he greeted Harry as he climbed onto the footstool next to him. "Hello," the boy said in a lazy voice that Harry was pretty sure his dad would envy. "Hogwarts too?" "Yeah," Harry replied casually, not sure if his response was a required elaboration. "My father's next door buying my books, and mother's up the street looking at wands. Then I'm going to drag them off to start looking at racing brooms. I don't see why first years can't have their own. I think I'll bully father into getting me one, and I'll smuggle it in somehow. Have you got your own broom?" "Unfortunately," Harry grumbled. "My dad bought me a Twigger for my 10th birthday. He thinks he's funny." "A Twigger?" the boy asked with a derisive snort. Harry almost rolled his eyes at the boy's rudeness. He reminded him of some of the general's sons back home. "You mustn't be very good at flying, then." Harry scowled, but managed to bite his tongue on the angry retort he wanted to give. His dad, at least, had managed to teach him how to hold his anger. "I'm a perfectly fine flyer," he said instead. "He lets me use his Comet when he doesn't need it." Not that Roy flew much, as he much preferred driving. "Do you play Quidditch, then?" the boy asked, sounded interested in Harry for the first time. "No," Harry replied. "It's not really that big an Amestris." "You're from Amestris?" This time the boy was clearly interested. His eyes widened in surprise, and he half turned to face Harry before the witch sharply tugged on his robes. "What are you going to Hogwarts for, then? What's your surname?" His surname? "My birth parents are from England, and I wanted to go to their school. And it's Potter. Why?" "You're not—" The boy's eyes flickered up to Harry's messy bangs, behind which Harry knew his scar could be seen. "You are!" He looked briefly impressed, but smoothly cleared the expression away as Harry stared at him. "I am what?" Harry asked, nettled. "Harry Potter." "Oh, him." With a shake of his head, he managed to give the other boy a small smile. "I mean, yes, I am. It wasn't as nearly impressive back home as it seems to be here. Honestly, I don't know why everyone's so impressed about. I was a baby. It's not like I even remember it." The boy looked at him as if he'd just said something monumentally stupid, which Harry admitted was entirely possible. But he didn't get a chance to say anything before the witch working on his robes said cheerfully, "That's you done, Mr. Malfoy?" "Oh, thanks," the boy said distractedly as he stepped down from the footstool. He turned back to Harry, though, as if he was magnetically attracted to him. "My name's Draco Malfoy," he introduced, raising a hand, but then jerking it back just as quickly. "I'd shake your hand, but Madame Malkin might stab you with a pin." The witch in question snorted, but her mouth was too full of pins to talk. "It's okay," Harry said, not having wanted to risk that very thing. "We bow in Amestris, but you don't have to. I think that'd get me stabbed too." "Now, why are we stabbing you?" Roy's voice asked as he poked his head into the back room. He grinned at Draco Malfoy, a little sharply, and the pale boy's eyes widened only a little. Harry had seen grown men quail in the face of that grin, but either Draco was made of sterner stuff, or he just didn't have the sense to know it was a threat. "I feel I should note that, as an Amestrian citizen, you have the full right to call in the military if you are injured today." "Why would I need to call in the military?" Harry wondered aloud. "You're right here to set people on fire for looking at me funny, aren't you?" Ignoring both his dad's increasingly sharp grin and Draco's uncertain look. He nodded in Draco's direction. "Dad, this is Draco Malfoy. He's going to Hogwarts too. No one is actually stabbing me. Malfoy, this is my foster father." Roy Mustang. "It's a pleasure to meet you, sir," Draco said with surprising politeness, holding out a hand for Roy to shake. Roy took it with a bemused look. "Pleasure," Roy responded automatically, then looked back at Harry and Madame Malkin. "Are you almost done in here? Ed's back already and getting restless. Please don't let him get bored." "Your timing is quite lucky, Mr. Mustang," Madame Malkin responded, giving Harry's pinned robes a last tug. "You're done, my dear." Harry hopped down from the footstool gratefully and bowed his thanks to the witch, and then turned back to Draco to shake his hand. Draco's grip was much firmer than Harry expected, but the shake was perfunctory. "Draco, there you are," a stern voice greeted them as they strolled back into the main store. Draco's back stiffened abruptly as he marched over to the tall man with long blonde hair. "I wouldn't have thought getting new robes would take nearly as long." "My apologies, Father," Draco said in a lazy voice that didn't sound sorry in the slightest. "I'm afraid I got caught up in a discussion with Potter here." The older man looked sharply over at Roy and Harry, his eyes darting up to Harry's fringe before he smiled politely. Harry was getting tired of everyone looking at his forehead, as if it was supposed to be the most important aspect of him. "Potter, Mr. Mustang," Draco continued calmly. "This is my father, Lucius Malfoy. Father, this is Harry Potter and his foster father, Roy Mustang." "I'm afraid Harry failed to introduce me to your son completely," Roy said with a smile as he moved to shake Lucius's hand. "But then my full title is quite a mouthful. Brigadier General Roy Mustang, the Flame Alchemist. It's a pleasure to meet you, Mr. Malfoy." "The pleasure is mine, I'm sure," Lucius replied without a hint that Roy's title had surprised him, though his son's expression more than made up for it. "Am I right in assuming you're a Mestrian, then? I don't believe many nations include named alchemists in their military." "Amestris is the only one so far," Roy said pleasantly. His hands moved behind his back into the at ease position, which Harry frowned at. His dad didn't usually stand like that unless he was talking to another military official. Harry's frown deepened when he noticed Ed striding over with a scowl on his face. But Roy only smiled as Ed took a position on his left side. "Ah, and may I introduce my lover, Edward Elric." This time Lucius's eyebrows did shoot up in surprise, a faint line appearing between his eyebrows as Ed held out his left hand to shake. The older blonde took it a little slowly, but he shook Ed's hand as professionally as he had shaken Roy's, and his polite smile didn't even falter. "Nice to meet you," Ed said, then turned to Roy, giving him an impatient look. "Can we get going, or what? This one lady keeps giving me the stink eye, like she's expecting that I'm going to set fire to the fabric or something." "I suppose we should get going before you actually do that out of spite," Roy sighed, but his posture relaxed as his left hand ran smoothly down Ed's back. Ed seemed to relax at the touch as well, his scowl fading into a slightly less terrifying frown. "It was lovely meeting you both, Misters Malfoy." "You as well," Lucius said, stepping to the side when Ed brushed past him on his way out to the door. His manners were terrible, but nobody seemed overly annoyed by them, so Harry sketched a bow at both of the Malfoys and followed after. But even as his dad caught up to him, ruffling his hair in a friendly manner, Harry was sure he could feel two pairs of eyes peering intently at his back. And that is Chapter 1 of The Path of Flame. I know I said the last chapter was Chapter 1, but technically it was the prologue, so this is the official Chapter 1. So I would like to really thank you all for joining me for this chapter, and I hope I get to see you in Chapter 2, or Video 3 I guess. And thanks again for putting up with my horrendous Roy and Ed voices, and I can guarantee that Draco's isn't going to get any better. But anyway, thanks for listening. I'm Tequila Mockingbird, and I'll see you next video.